All right, so we are kind of discovering, we talked about Darwin's tortoises and birds and how they were different, but Darwin also looked at the topography, or the way that the islands were formed. And those are the Galapagos Islands that they studied, or that he studied and made all these observations on. So what he saw is that a competitive exclusion, which is like if all the birds ate seeds, eventually birds would adapt to eat other things as well, because there was lots of competition. There was a limited amount of seeds, lots of birds, so we saw some competition, that birds would eventually evolve to eat, or adapt to eat, other things. And then because of those adaptations, it would eventually lead to speciation if there was enough difference. So what he saw as well is that each island had its own type of tortoise and birds that were clearly different from the other islands. So not only did he see different species, not only did he see differences between the species from island to island, he noticed that the island had something to do with it as well. So we're going to talk about how a species might form as well. Just a quick review of where we've been. So we talked about Lamarck and his theory of acquired characteristics. So Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck formed one of the first theories of evolution. Lamarck proposed that traits developed over the course of an organism's lifetime were passed down from the next generation. It's true that traits are passed down from generation to generation, but all of them not according to Mendel's experiments, which we will talk about another day. But Darwin was the one who found the evidence to support this idea, and he used that based, or the why or the how of the evolution is based on natural selection, which we're learning about right now. So much of today's understanding of evolution is based on Darwin's initial findings and ideas. The theory of natural selection describes how species change over time and adapt to their environment. That's what we're learning right now. All organisms compete for survival. Space and food are limited, so organisms with traits most survivable to an environment will beat out the other organisms for survival, a concept called survival of the fittest. The trait that gives organisms a survival advantage is passed on from the offspring when it reproduces, so it should really be thought of survival and reproduction of the fittest. All right, so back to the finches though. Here's how we form a new species. First, a portion of the gene pool has to become isolated, which is the process of generating a new species. So we take two species that were exactly the same ones, and then we separate them via like physical separation, like the island, or sometimes it's just mountain ranges that separate one species from another, or one population from another. So our population must be split and isolated, and then the two populations must accumulate genetic changes that differ from population to population until eventually they'll create a distinct group of their own. So we talked about a geographical isolation, so like a mountain range or a physical barrier, which separates the two populations, so like a river or a mountain. There's also ecological isolation, so species occur in the same area, but they occupy different habitats, like our lizards there. One is a ground lizard, so they want to adapt traits that are best for living on the ground, and one is a tree lizard, so they want to adapt traits that are best for living on the trees. And then we can also have temporal isolation, so species reproduce in different seasons or at different times of day. That can separate the two species as well. So those are three ways that we might get speciation. These squirrels live on opposite sides of the Grand Canyon. Can you see how they're different? They have distinct similarities for sure. They definitely have 4 legs. They've got the fluffy tail, both of them. They've even both got those fluffy little ears. But one of them has a white belly, while the other one has a black belly. Some other differences I can see: this one has a distinct brown stripe down its back. This one has a darker black stripe down its back. This tail is a lot wilder than this one. It looks like this one spent some time combing his tail. But this could be just because they live on opposite sides of the Grand Canyon. So Darwin decided, or had this idea, that the speciation of the Galapagos finches in particular occurred first because they were geographically separated, they were on different islands, which led to a reproductive isolation. If you're in different spaces or at different times, or what was the other way we said? Ecological isolation. So if you live on the ground versus the tree, well, the ground versus the tree is not necessarily, but you're reproductively isolated. That means that that part of the gene pool is taken away if you have isolated from the other species. And then because we get reproductive isolations, that can lead to changes in the gene pool driven by competition. So because we're separated and we are occupying different spaces, we can't reproduce together, which is going to change the gene pool, and also we're experiencing different things, so our competition is going to be different, meaning that natural selection is going to select for different traits depending on where you are. So for example, if I was a seed-eating finch in an island where there were lots of seeds present, then the competition would be who has the best beak for eating seeds. But that beak wouldn't help me if I was living on an island where there weren't that many seeds, but there were lots of insects. So then the competition switches, and the trait that is most selected for, or that you want the most, is a beak that is really good for eating insects. Can you see how that might happen? We're going to talk about natural selection for a second. I read you a brief introduction to what it is. But it's the process by which members of species are best suited to their environment to survive and reproduce at higher rates than other species members. We often term it the survival of the fittest. So this is the idea that the most desirable traits, or the traits that help the species survive the best, are going to be passed down to the offspring, eventually leading to those traits being most prevalent in the population. So I talked once about moths in Europe. Let's see if I can find that for you. Let's see if I will get the pictures that I would like. Okay, so we've got these two kinds of moths right here. We have a black-looking moth and it's called the peppered moth. So during the Industrial Revolution, we found, or before the Industrial Revolution, this type of moth was very prevalent, one that could very easily camouflage into the tree. They were peppered, they were light because the tree bark was light in Europe. But then after we faced the Industrial Revolution, where coal became prominent, we saw a darkening of our trees because of the coal ash that was layered on there. So the other mutation, or the other version of the species, was this one right here. And that was better able to blend into the now darker trees. So then we saw a switch. So the majority of the population was this one right here, because they were best able to survive and camouflage themselves. So their genes were spread on to the offspring. So the majority of the population looked like this. And then when we saw a switch in the environment that the moth lived, so the trees became darker because of that coal ash, these ones were more easily picked up by a predator than, say, these ones. So eventually, after a couple of generations, we started to see populations that were majority looked like this, because they could better blend into the trees. They weren't eaten as often. So they passed their desirable traits on to their offspring, and then our population became mostly black moths versus this peppered-looking moth. Okay, so that's just one example of natural selection, but it happens in many different places. But it is the survival of the fittest, so who has the best chance of surviving? Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection based on 4 key principles. We're going to go through those right now. The first one is overproduction. So this idea that when a plant or animal reproduces, it usually makes more offspring than the environment can support. So we've got too many offspring, not enough food, not enough shelter, not enough water. Whatever that limiting factor is, it's just the environment can't support it. So in order for natural selection to work or to be true, then we have to have an overproduction of offspring. Natural selection, so that was number 1. Number 2, natural selection also assumes that there is variation within a species. So that means that within a species there are natural differences in traits among individuals, aka we have a difference in genetics. If I don't have a difference in genetics, then I can't select for the best trait. What I've got is what I've got. So there's got to be an option A or an option B or even C and D. There's got to be a trait that is desirable and a trait that is not so desirable. So we've got to have that variation. So first we have to have too many offspring. Second, we've got to have differences in genes. Third, we've got to have a mutation. So it needs to be possible for a change in genetic material causing a new variation to come, which can be passed to the next generation. So we've got to have a mutation in there somewhere that helps give us the change that we would like. So mutation is not actually on your notes. Mutation goes along with variation, so mutation is a cause of variation. So it could be just because we have our recessive allele that hides in our dominant allele that we get those genetic changes, but it could also be that something has altered the DNA to create a mutated organism, which is not always necessarily bad. I would like you to please type this somewhere in your notes. Okay, next and thirdly, we have adaptation. So the trait must be inheritable. That gives an organism an advantage to a particular environment. So adaptation means that you've changed to better fit your environment. So that's the trait that we're looking at for natural selection. How did the organism adapt to better survive? And lastly, we have selection. So an individual organism with a particular adaptation that are most likely to survive long enough will pass the adaptation to the next generation. So we've got to have, again, to review, too many organisms. We've got to have genetic variation within a species, which is often because of mutation or a change in the genetic material. We've got to have an adaptation, so some kind of trait that enables the organism to better survive, and then that trait needs to be selected for, or organisms that have that trait must reproduce and create the next generation, passing along to it the adaptation. So as this process repeats from generation to generation, we will see a population that has that adaptation grow larger and larger. Eventually the species will evolve over time and possibly become a new species based on the adaptation. There are a couple, and it looks like this is going to end up being 3 lectures as well. We will stop with the evidence supporting evolution, but let's talk about artificial selection again. We talked a lot about this when we were talking about biotechnology, so we're not going to talk too much about this, but this is the outside force guiding the natural selection, or the human messing with the natural selection. So we can control this in some of our organisms. Like, remember we talked about how we would select for the tallest plant or the plant that produces the most crop because that's what we want. We do that with animals as well, like our cattle. We want our cattle that are like the biggest, right? So that we can have lots of meat from it. Or we want chickens with the biggest breasts so we can eat a lot of chicken meat, and vice versa. Nature provides variation, and then so we don't necessarily change the DNA, although we can. We learned that in our biotechnology unit, but we do select the trait that we would like. So a farmer breeds only his best livestock. We also do this with dog breeds. This is how we got all the breeds we have today. We talked a lot about this though, so that's all we're going to cover for then. We will pick back up with the evidence supporting evolution in the next lecture. Have a great day, guys.